Okay, hello.
Recording in progress.
So great. Welcome back, everybody. So it's a bit of context. A core idea of prosocial design, if not the core idea, is that design matters. How you design an online space will affect, if not determine, how people engage in that space. And for much, or if not most of the time, what that really means is that we're making design choices that nudge people towards pro-social choices, hopefully, or outcomes, right? And for some, that doesn't sit quite right. Critics would say that even pro-social nudges may have good intentions. They'd chip away, if not subvert, individual agency. So our two guests today, Philipp Lorenz-Spreen and David Grüning, are researchers and proponents of an alternative and allegedly more agency-friendly approach to pro-social design, boosting. And I'm hearing a lot of background noise from someone. I'm wondering if everyone is muted. And let me see if we can, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. Thanks so much. So just in terms of a brief intro, so Philipp is a computational social scientist at the Max Planck Institute and also leads a research group at TU Dresden. David is finishing up his dissertation at Heidelberg and is about to start two postdocs kind of at Max Planck and Stanford. And they're both prolific researchers in the pro-social design space. And perhaps their greatest achievement is that they're both Prosocial Design Network board members. Seriously, though, we're really lucky to have their support and PDN, and so delighted that you guys are here and we're having this conversation today. So welcome, Philipp and David. Yay. Philipp, let's start with you. So just can you give us the basics on boosting? What is it? What are its central principles? And why do you see it as preferable to nudging?
Okay, good. Yes, of course. I'm happy to probably there's one more person in the world who would be even better suited to describe this distinction between boosting and nudging and the advantages of nudging or this alternative approaches. This would be Ralph Hertwig, who is the director of the institute where I am coming from. But I'll do my best because I've been kind of raised by him and this idea. So as you just said, nudging is very common, of course, very popular since this book by Sunstein, and has been proliferated in public policy, but also in the online world, for example. And I think one trick about nudging is that it's a very general term. It basically regards almost all types of changes in the choice environment or the choice architecture, right? That's something that you could call the all the different cues and the environment within which you make decisions. And online, obviously, this is quite thought through and engineered. So if you go to a website, a social media platform, all these little buttons and functions and scrolling and whatsoever, this is all designed, and this would all count as some way of a nudge, I would say. And especially if it's has been put there in order to guide you somewhere, for example, to order a product, to go to the shopping cart and to buy it or whatsoever. That would be a nudge when there's a very prominent button or something like this. The problem about nudging is, so first of all, the goal of nudging is steering behavior. So all the outcome measures are usually behavioral outcome measures. And one would say the person who does the nudging will have to know better what is good for you or what you should do, because the nudge will guide you there. And this is already basically also the core problem. It's the paternalistic aspect of nudging. It always means that the person, the nudger, or sometimes also called the choice architect, so the person who is designing that space or that environment in which you navigate in, will or basically says he or she knows better what's good for you. Sometimes this might be true. Maybe for, let's say, smoking cigarettes, there's a good scientific evidence that it is not healthy, and maybe these pictures and warning labels and all these things that you would probably count as a nudge may be actually in your best interest, but it doesn't always have to be the case. For example, buying some of the products that you actually don't need or whatever, maybe is not really in your interest. So that's the biggest critique. So it's a normative critique. There are other critiques of nudging that it may be not so effective and they wear off. For example, you can get used to nudges. But mostly it's a normative argument, and that's where boosting comes in. Boosting, the biggest difference, and I think the most useful distinction, is that the goal of boosting is not behavior, but competences. So the idea is that instead of guiding you to not smoke a cigarette, I'll basically help you to understand what's the problem about cigarettes, right? And that's a competence. Basically that is the main distinction. What is similar about it is that also boosting aims to be an intervention that is relatively lightweight and part of the environment in one way or another, or it can be like a little rule of thumb that you can easily learn and then apply later on. I think another distinction is also the reversibility. So a nudge, if you remove the nudge from the environment, the effect should be totally gone. Yeah, if the button is smaller again, or if the warning is gone, it should be there shouldn't be an effect anymore. However, for the boost, there should be something that stays because you learned a competence. There's some learning effect, and I think these are some ways to distinguish the two. And obviously, it's not clear cut. So there is some kind of gray zone between the two. Some nudgers have been talking about educative nudges, for example. So nudges that guide you to certain information, for example. And then there are boosts that are very lightweight and very much part of the environment. And that is where they both meet. Yeah. One important aspect of boosting is also that it's not education. It's not in a classroom and you get taught a certain course. It is something that is part of your daily routine, of your environment, or a rule of thumb, but it needs to be something very simple that you can acquire in your daily life. Yeah, that's probably what it is.
Okay, that is fantastic. And I'm almost convinced, but you said there's lots of gray area. And so now we get to kind of dig into the details. So David, could you give us a more concrete idea of like what examples of boosts are and maybe what they're, what the alternative or the improvement on nudges?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I can basically, like, what I would like to start is with an example that's quite prominent to many people, which is all about inoculation. So like boosting against misinformation. I think like one thing that a lot of people know are these like inoculation games, right? So it's basically an idea of putting people in the shoes of a misinformer. So like a person that tries to like spread misinformation far and wide and as far as they can, basically. And the idea is to like, while you go through this like process of being this person that tries to spread misinformation, you build some kind of like resistance against these misinformation techniques, but also you acquire the skill or this competency to identify these techniques or these persuasion attempts. The idea is basically that afterwards, and that's a bit like this difference to just a nudge, right? So you could also have like an accuracy nudge, for example, right? I think that's also quite prominent that you see this in social media, and that's just like a little prompt that comes with an informative post that says like maybe check for accuracy, like be aware. And this is something that I think is quite clear for just being a nudge. Because if you take it away, then also there's like no real like competency that users build. It really comes with the design change, this nudge. And for the inoculation game, the idea at least is, I mean, we can like debate the actual evidence, right? Like and how far it goes. But the idea would be that this is something that like builds something up that's like intrinsic to the user or like to the person that then is confronted with a lot of like misinformation afterwards and can identify, at least with like a higher likelihood, if there's like a persuasion attempt. One other thing I think that's interesting that goes a little bit like a different route, it's also not about misinformation per se, is self-nudging, which is yet again like another term. And I think one very specific concept that's interesting, that's like getting some traction now in research is technically assisted self-nudging. So anything that you basically see with like browser extensions or smartphone applications. And the idea is really that, again, like we go back to this idea of like people have personal agency. So it's they can change different things about the environment that they see themselves as like useful regarding certain needs they have, or like certain issues that might be quite personal, right? And that are like just not addressed by universal nudging. And I think one other thing that makes it to be an actual boost, so like it actually lets people learn about their patterns and like build some skill in like nudging the environment, is that these technical assistants, they can also give you a lot of feedback about like how your nudges work, what might be bigger problems, and what might work quite well, right? And so I think especially these tech assistants are super interesting ideas of even like continuous and like reinforced boosting, where you like try some things out like on a beginning like information basis, and then you get some more information and you optimize basically.
So there's so much to cover, but so little time. I have 2 more questions for you guys. So if you maybe like a brief answer so we can open up to breakout rooms and people can kind of dig in. So Philip, you made a good point already about, and both of you made a point of how nudging is kind of short term and immediate, and if it goes away, the effect disappears. But what is the evidence that boosting actually has long-term effects, or is an or has any effect?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is evidence that there are different types of boosts that work, but the literature is not as developed as it is for nudging. Yeah, that's something we have to be clear about. I think, for example, I did an experiment where I tried to teach people how to spot micro-targeted advertising by making them aware of some of the features that might be targeted about themselves, and then they were actually better. That is a boost that seemed to work. There on this website I shared, Science of Boosting, there are a few more examples also from the offline world, about boosts about your, health and your food and things like that, where there are rules of thumbs that you can easily memorize about, for example, how to check for ingredients and things like that. When it comes to the digital world, I'll share this one that I just mentioned briefly. And one family that also David already mentioned is the inoculation games and all the literature around that. That might maybe something where there's kind of accumulating evidence. And there's this literature around Weinberg from Stanford, who's doing lateral reading, which is an educative intervention that teaches you to evaluate a news source, not by staying on the website, but doing an external search and checking for other sources. And that has been also turned into a boost intervention by like small videos on YouTube that teach you to do it. So those are some examples of boosts that have been shown to work. But still the evidence is, I think, a bit scarce. It can be improved.
Thank you about being honest about how we need more research, and that's a good thing. I mean, we're saying that because we always want to promote more research. So I'm thinking maybe we should have kind of some horse race competition between boosting and nudging. Maybe that's in the future of someone's research agenda. We're going to open it up to Q&A in a moment, but while you guys are formulating your questions, last one from me to you, David. So my understanding is a lot, and you guys have touched on a lot of the current work around boosting it is related to misinformation. And Philip, you actually talked about people being aware of being targeted by ads, as well as regulating your social media use. How expansive can the idea of boosting be? However, how do you what other areas of prosocial design do you see it applying to?
So I think like conceptually, it can basically apply to all the like the pro-social goals that we also try to design the internet for, right? I think like one, on top of my head, like one example that I think is interesting and is not in these like two realms of like where we see a lot of like boosting in the digital space, has to do with like some recent studies on social badges. So people like joining a Reddit channel, for example, they get like a certain, like a little badge basically that assigns them to a certain role that they can like play and like be in the space. And then it's always like paired with like tips, tricks, and like an information sheet basically on like how to do this. So one would be like a pro-social badge, right? Like pro-social or like positive discourse and reinforcement. And then you get like a list of like little tips, like how to do this, like how to enact these like more positive interactions. And I think that would be, for me, this falls under like boosting approach. And that's actually a quite cool, I think, idea that goes way beyond misinformation, that you can basically like this batching thing is also, as far as I'm concerned, like way more fleshed out in the gaming area, but that would be something super cool to also bring into social media. And I think this has a lot of like the boosting idea and the concept.
Well, thank you, Chu. I'm gonna move to Q&A, and so before we do that, we'll end the recording.